folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome back to the History of New Orleans. Last time we went over the last few decades of the 18th century, which saw dramatic changes for New Orleans and the rest of the world, mostly as a result of the French Revolution. The most impactful of these changes was Napoleon's sale of French Louisiana to the United States of America. Even though this wasn't the first time ownership of New Orleans had changed hands, it was the first time it was no longer an overseas colony of some European power. However, over the next 2 centuries, New Orleans would hold on to its European cultural heritage better than any city in the U.S., while also becoming a beacon of the unique and beautiful African American culture that was cultivated in the city. But all of that is in the future. Our story left off just 6 weeks after Louisiana, with its capital of New Orleans, officially became integrated into the Union as a state. We stopped here because New Orleans only had a month and a half to settle into its new position before America declared war on Great Britain, starting the War of 1812. Now at this point, the US was only 36 years old if you count from the Declaration of Independence, or 23 years old if you count from the ratification of the Constitution. It had still managed to tangle itself in a number of conflicts. These include a number of wars with Indian nations, a couple with North African nations, and a quasi-war with Republican France, in which the two nations engaged in limited naval aggression against each other. None of these conflicts had the slightest impact on New Orleans, except for the quasi-war's short interruption in merchant activities. Additionally, none of these conflicts constituted an existential threat to American sovereignty. The wars with the Native Americans were largely frontier territorial disputes, and the technological industrial advantage the U.S. held meant that even though they were long drawn-out affairs, the U.S. was never really threatened. The North African wars were fought because Barbary pirates had begun seizing merchant ships once they no longer were under the protection of the British Royal Navy. Neither of these wars included an invasion of U.S. soil. Likewise, the quasi-war was fought entirely at sea, and the objective of both sides was to disrupt trade rather than conquer territory. The War of 1812 was a departure from the trends set by America's early wars. It was the first time the U.S. had officially gone to war with a powerful nation since the War of Independence. In fact, at the time, Great Britain was considered the most powerful nation in the world. Even though America had defeated them just over 30 years ago, many observers doubted that they could do it again. If the odds were so against the scrappy young country, why did they declare war in the first place? The justification for the war came down to 5 key points. First was Britain's trade war with France. During the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, France and Britain had gone blow for blow on the battlefield and at sea. There was also another front in which they fought, the economic front. France attempted to cripple the British economy by establishing the Continental System, in which, through diplomacy and strong-arm tactics, they tried to get all the nations of Europe to cease trading with the British Isles. In response, Britain used their overwhelming naval power to effectively block all trade to France from the sea. Even though America and France had not been on the best of terms since the Quasi-War, France was still a major trade partner of the U.S. Furthermore, the U.S. had remained neutral throughout the European conflicts of the last 30 years, and so they did not believe that they should be subject to the British blockade that harmed them as much as it did France. Britain saw it differently, and so they began seizing U.S. merchant ships that attempted to trade in France. This leads us to our second key point, the impressment of U.S. sailors. No, this does not mean that the U.S. seamen were so impressed by the might and majesty of the British Navy that they chose to join them. Impressment is just a term that means the Brits were forcefully recruiting American sailors. Every time the British seized a U.S. vessel, they claimed that the crew were really deserters from the British Navy, and that they had to join the war to finish their terms of service. This obvious falsehood enraged the American government and the general population, who rightfully saw it as an attack on America's sovereignty. In order to maintain its neutrality, successive U.S. administrations had had to struggle with the popular opinion of the citizenry. The country was quite split on who they supported between France and Britain. An overwhelming majority of the U.S.'s population were of Anglo-Saxon ancestry, and even though they had declared independence from their homeland, they still felt a strong cultural bond with the British Isles. In the early years of the country, there was also a strong affinity, especially among some of the founding fathers, towards France. The French had played a large role in winning the War of Independence, and many Americans saw the French revolutionaries as kindred spirits, fighting for liberty and equality. This goodwill had gradually dissipated as the realities of divergent geopolitical goals came into play. The Quasi-War was the death knell of the Franco-American alliance. By 1812, the reason for neutrality had changed from the two sides of American opinion differing on whether they liked the British or the French more, to them differing on whether they hated the British or the French more. There was a definite shift towards George Washington's point of view, that America should just stay out of affairs on the European continent. But that leads us to our third key point, because the War of 1812 was not just about affairs on the European continent. As much as Americans were angry about the interruptions in trade that the British had imposed on them, there was also a domestic component. All the past wars of the last 30 years with the Native Americans weren't really just against the Native Americans. The indigenous people found willing allies in the British, who sought to check American expansionism by providing military aid to their cause. The U.S. was well aware that the British were supplying arms and ammunition to their native enemies, and this stoked further resentment within the population. But the frontier was vast and untamed. How could the U.S. possibly keep the Native Americans from receiving shipments from the British? Well, by kicking the British off the continent, of course. That leads us into our fourth key point, American desire for an annexation of Canada. See, American expansionism was not just the idea that the U.S. should spread from sea to shining sea, but also that it should extend from head to toe, from Canada to Panama. There was a certain arrogance in believing that an entire continent should belong to one nation, but if one word can be used to describe American expansionists, it is arrogance. It seemed natural that Canada should join the United States. After all, they had just recently been brother colonies under the yoke of the British Crown. But there was not much desire among the Canadians to join the U.S. They were not nearly as unhappy with their situation as the 13 colonies had been. If they were going to become a part of the USA, it would have to be by force. The fifth and final key point is really a summation of the previous points. Simply put, Americans were angry at the British for not respecting them. They didn't respect their trade rights, they didn't respect their territorial claims, and they didn't treat America as a sovereign nation. In many ways, Americans still felt as though they were being condescended to by the British government, just as they had been during the colonial days. That was the broad point of view, but what did the city of New Orleans feel about declaring war in 1812? Well, by now there was a sizable population of Anglo-Americans living in the city, and we can assume that they shared many of the opinions of their brothers in the original 13 colonies. Overall, though, the city was still dominated by the Creole population, and their point of view had some nuance to it. The rich Creole merchant class was certainly angry at the British for interrupting trade, and they were already predisposed towards disliking the English for their long rivalry with France. There was also a bit of the expansionist attitude among this group, as they were nominally a part of the frontier. Further expansion would mean more markets to sell to, and safety from Native American raids that no longer threatened New Orleans, but had once in the past and had left some psychic scars on the Creole populace. This expansionism did not, however, really include Canada. It was so far north and not really connected to New Orleans via the Mississippi. Though perhaps there were a few Cajuns who felt that it would be justice for the British to be expelled from Nova Scotia, just as they had been a few generations ago. These were all ideas weighing on the wealthy and powerful of New Orleans, but we can't assume they held much sway over the less fortunate population. The large majority of the citizenry didn't really have a vested interest in expansionism, and they had only been U.S. citizens for 9 years at this point, so patriotism wasn't really a driving force in their lives. For the slaves of New Orleans and Louisiana, there was absolutely no reason for them to support the War of 1812. What did they gain from it? Absolutely nothing. Pulling against all the reasons that those in charge of New Orleans might support the war was one big reason that they might not have. Any observer could see that should the U.S. go to war with the British Empire, they would be attacked from two places. One was up north from Canada, and the other was by sea. While the northern frontier had been a battleground for almost a century, and America had a robust series of fortifications in the area, there was no doubt that the American Navy couldn't hold a candle to the Royal Navy, who held absolute supremacy over the world's oceans. New Orleans, as one of the most prominent port cities in America, would certainly be a target for the British. If I was living in New Orleans in 1812, I would have been more than a little worried that unlike all the new world wars that had occurred over the last century, the city would not be able to escape this one unscathed. So there was a little bit of fear and a little bit of excitement in New Orleans over the prospect of the War of 1812. Amidst the danger of the war, there was opportunity. Opportunity for those with flexible morals and endless ambition, aka the criminal underground of New Orleans. As I have previously stated, there was always a criminal element in the Crescent City. Its first inhabitants had been dredged from the depths of France's prison, and their meager social and economic position in the New World meant that criminality remained one of their only options for survival. For those with the wits and the aptitude, immorality became a business just like any other in New Orleans. Bootlegging, prostitution, and petty theft were the most common occupations for criminals, and even as the colonial officials made a big show of cracking down at various times in the city's history, there was something about New Orleans that meant that the infestation could never be eradicated. Maybe they were just too entrenched since the days of the city's founding, or maybe there was something in the character of New Orleans that attracted a certain flair for illegality. Whatever the case, criminals made New Orleans their home, and are as much a part of its fabric as any good upstanding citizen. Of importance to our story is a particular pair of rogues who would eventually cement themselves within New Orleans folklore, but who would come shrouded in myth and mystery. We must now introduce Pierre and Jean Lafitte. The Lafitte brothers were either born in France or Saint-Domingue. It is not known which, but we do know that they were of French origin. We also know that they grew up around the trade of seafaring, as their father was a merchant, and they were trained to operate naval vessels from a young age. Being a skilled sailor in that day and age meant that there were many careers open to you, some more enticing and lucrative than others. You could serve in a country's navy, although this prospect meant a life of tedium and boredom punctuated sporadically by extreme threats to life and limb. It was an honorable path, but it wasn't very glamorous. You could set out alone as a merchant, either shipping someone else's cargo or forming your own company. This venture offered the possibility of greater fortune than a life in the Navy, but it too had its own risk. It's possible that you could lose everything if your ship was seized by pirates or if temperamental weather smashed your vessel to bits. The third option was to go into the business of piracy. Now this job offered danger, excitement, and the possibility of massive monetary reward if done efficiently. So of course the Lafittes chose the third option. Among pirates there were two distinct groups, official and unofficial. Unofficial pirates were the true marauders of the sea, beholden to no one but themselves. But unofficial pirates also risked a lot more. They could be attacked and killed by other pirates, or by any other vessel including navy ships, which carried much more firepower than your average merchant. If you wanted to mitigate these risks, you could become an official pirate, aka a privateer. Privateers carried official documents from a sovereign government that gave them the right to seize foreign ships and cargo as long as it was done with minimal bloodshed and as long as said cargo was sold directly to the sponsoring nation. Now this meant that any booty seized would have to be registered with the proper authorities and the appropriate taxes would have to be paid. But who's to say that of the 100 crates of sugar you took, Half of them were somehow quote-unquote lost at sea, and could the authorities really prove that the 50 crates that were smuggled illegally into the port really came from this seized cargo? That is how privateers made their living, by legally operating as pirates and skimming off their official expropriated goods to turn a bigger profit. Now, there were many places across the globe for privateers to ply their trade, but probably the most famous and lucrative place was the Caribbean. The constant extraction of valuable resources from European colonies on the islands of the Caribbean meant that there was never a shortage of heavily laden merchant ships just lazily meandering around the ocean. Once these fat heifers were commandeered by the privateers, their wares would need to be sold at market. That is where New Orleans comes into play. The capital of Louisiana wasn't the only port around the Caribbean, but it had a few traits that made it a premier destination for illicit smuggling. For one thing, other than the few plantations that had sprouted up around it, New Orleans wasn't really a big producer of any of the cash crops that were the real money makers in the Caribbean. It was much easier to fetch a good price for stolen sugar, tobacco, and any other crops at a port that didn't produce its own. New Orleans was also administered less rigorously than Havana in Cuba or Kingston in Jamaica. It was also more peaceful than those other ports. Privateers thrived during wartime, when countries with smaller navies handed out contracts freely in order to supplement their meager naval force with freelance pirates. But this was a double-edged sword, as war meant a greater presence of heavily armed ships and greater scrutiny at port cities. New Orleans remained just insignificant enough in the grand sprawl of the European wars that it was a safe haven during times of strife. It was for all these reasons and more that the Lafitte's began operating in New Orleans during the first few years of the 1800s. This was a good time to get into the privateer business. Napoleon's war with Britain spread the Royal Navy thin and left the merchant navies of both France and Britain vulnerable to attack. Furthermore, tensions with America and Britain were ramping up in the lead-up to the War of 1812, which caused the U.S. to enact the Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited all foreign trade. This hurt the merchant class of New Orleans greatly, and they sought extra legal help to get their goods to market, and ordinary citizens still demanded European imports, which could now only be provided by criminal means. The business of smuggling was booming, and the Lafitte's were raking it in. However, this situation could not last forever. By 1810, repeated letters from government officials in New Orleans to the federal government complained about the widespread criminality in the Gulf of Mexico. A response would be forthcoming. The Lafitte's saw the storm approaching and decided that their interests would best be served if they got out of the way of the speeding train of the government crackdown. Brother Jean made his way down to a tiny uninhabited island in Barataria Bay. This little island was just a few miles south from New Orleans and had easy access to the Gulf of Mexico. It would serve as a base of operations for the Lafitte's, as goods could be dropped off there and then quietly smuggled through the bayous for sale in New Orleans. Jean ran the privateering branch of the business, while Pierre stayed in New Orleans, fronting as a respectable businessman to sell their illicit goods at a retail store on Chart Street. Over the first 2 years of their operation on Barataria Island, the Lafitte's served as brokers for local privateers. They would purchase their contraband for later sale in New Orleans, and sell the privateers supplies for their expeditions. Doing this, they turned a pretty profit, but for ambitious capitalists such as the Lafitte's, consistent returns are never satisfactory. The rate of profit must go up. So in October of 1812, 4 months after America declared war on Britain, the Lafitte's bought their first vessel, meaning that they could cease being the middleman for other privateers and vertically integrate the entire supply chain of legal goods flowing into New Orleans. By this time, the Lafitte's had made big enough waves that they were widely recognized figures in New Orleans society. This had its problems and benefits, as opinion was mixed. The general population thought of the Lafitte's as romantic swashbucklers who provided a necessary service to the community by smuggling in European goods that were in high demand, yet because of the Embargo Act of 1807 could not be bought legally. Jean Lafitte in particular went out of his way to cultivate this image by dressing more aristocratically than the stereotypical pirate and rubbing elbows with the members of high society at the New Orleans ballrooms. But this attention also meant that the Lafitte's were prime targets for law enforcement. On numerous occasions, the brothers were arrested and sent to trial. However, well-placed bribes to judges allowed them to always walk free. Their luck would run out eventually as the ambitious brothers expanded their operations and made more and more trouble. Governor Claiborne, who had originally turned a blind eye to the bandits because the citizens of New Orleans were so supportive of them, could no longer stand by. In November of 1812, just 1 month after the Lafitte's became true privateers, the District Attorney General for Louisiana charged Jean Lafitte with violating a revenue law. Thus began a game of cat and mouse between Claiborne and Lafitte. First, the Lafitte's and 25 of their men were arrested, but they posted bail and slipped away, refusing to appear for their trial. Then, in March of 1813, Jean Lafitte managed to acquire a letter of marque from the newly independent port of Cartagena, Colombia, to make his privateering business somewhat legitimate. Since he was still indicted under the charge of revenue fraud and had never stood trial, Claiborne ignored this letter of marque and posted a $500 reward for Lafitte. Comically, in New Orleans, papers were printed that offered a $500 award to anyone who arrested Claiborne. Despite the governor's crackdown on the Lafitte's, they kept antagonizing him by holding auctions for their stolen slaves and goods out in the open, just outside of New Orleans. That was their way of spitting in the face of Claiborne and the respectable merchants of New Orleans. This came back to bite them, however, as testimony from one of these respectable merchants led to a grand jury indicting Pierre Lafitte for aiding and abetting piracy, which resulted in his arrest and imprisonment. While all this back and forth between the Lafitte's and Claiborne was happening, the War of 1812 raged across the continent and at sea. Although the war was minuscule in terms of troops involved, it ranged across multiple fronts, and the inability for either side to land a decisive blow meant that it dragged on much longer than anyone had expected. To put the war's scale into perspective, we must consider that at its peak during the war, the U.S. Army was less than 40,000 men. This was supplemented by nearly 500,000 militiamen, but these troops were unreliable, untrained, and some were even unarmed. On the British side, their regular forces never went above 50,000, and due to the overlap with the wars against Napoleon, most of the time there was less than 10,000 British regulars in North America. They attempted to overcome this difference by turning to the tried and true European method in American wars, the recruitment of Native American allies, who did the bulk of the heavy lifting for the British. All these men were spread out on fronts from the Great Lakes to Maine and from the Mississippi to Chesapeake Bay. We will avoid going into detail about the course of the war, as it is a lengthy and outside the scope of our discussion of New Orleans, but it is important to note that by 1814, enthusiasm was waning on both sides, and they were both looking for a way out. The war had never been very popular outside of the few expansionist zealots in the American government, and the inability to gain significant territory over a course of many military campaigns made many Americans wonder why they were fighting in the first place. As the popularity of the war sank, it was compounded by the abdication of Napoleon in 1814, which freed up the British to send a massive and well-trained army to America to end the war. Hoping to get out before an overwhelming British victory, in August of 1814, negotiations between American and British diplomats began in the Belgian city of Ghent. This same month, the British would sail a force up the Chesapeake River and put the American capital of Washington to the torch. Whilst negotiations were ongoing, they also besieged Baltimore, at the time the third most populous city in America. This siege would be the inspiration for Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner. The British continued fighting during the negotiations as a tactic to extract further concessions from the Americans and to keep them from backing out. However, Baltimore and Washington weren't the British's only targets during these last few months of the war. They also looked south to the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi. The largest American force in the region was an army of about 5,000 men, which included 1,000 regulars, 3,000 militiamen, and around 1,000 Native American allies. This force was under the command of Major General Andrew Jackson, and he led them against minimal British forces. Jackson had total numerical superiority for most of 1814, and used this to clear British Native American allies out of the South. Then, in November, Jackson's army took Pensacola from the Spanish governor of West Florida under the pretense that they were harboring enemies of America. Jackson knew he would never be able to hold Pensacola if the large British army they were expecting to arrive any day now came, and he knew that the British desired to control the Mississippi by taking New Orleans. And so, on the 1st of December, 1814, he moved his remaining 4,000 men to the capital of Louisiana and began building a defense. 2 months earlier, a British ship had fired upon John Lafitte's ship and forced him to run aground in shallow waters. Captain Nicholas Lockyer, the commanding officer of the British ship, had not fired with intent to kill Lafitte, but rather to force him into a conversation. During this conversation, Lafitte was handed 2 letters, one from King George III of England and the other from the commander of the British Marines. King George's letter offered Lafitte citizenship of Great Britain and land rights in the Caribbean for him and his men, should he aid the British effort to take New Orleans. The other letter implored Lafitte to accept the offer, or the Marines had orders to invade Barataria and seize all of Lafitte's ships and cargo. Lafitte thanked the British officers for their consideration and told them that he would take their offer under advisement. In reality, Lafitte never really considered joining the British. There were several factors weighing him in the direction of either neutrality or supporting the Americans. For one, his brother Pierre was still being held in an American prison, essentially making him a hostage. For another, Jean was a proud Frenchman, and the idea of helping the British was an insult to his national pride. Perhaps foremost on his mind, however, was the idea that he could use the threat of the British offer to negotiate a favorable deal with the Americans, who he believed would be the overall victors in the War of 1812. Almost immediately, Lafitte forwarded the British letters to an ally of his in the state legislature of Louisiana, along with a personal letter to Governor Claiborne, implying that he and his men would aid in the defense of New Orleans if his brother was released from jail. It is a testament to how dire of a situation New Orleans was in that 2 days after Lafitte's letter was delivered to Claiborne, Pierre mysteriously slipped out of captivity. Still, the American government did not really trust the word of a privateer, and so in order to hedge their bets, they executed a raid on Barataria, which saw them capture at least 80 of Lafitte's men, along with the seizure of a large portion of his fleet and $500,000 worth of merchandise. So Claiborne had given up his leverage of Pierre, but gained the advantage in negotiations by holding Jean's wealth captive. The next order of business was for the governor to pardon Lafitte and his men, but he did not have the authority to do this. He wrote to the Attorney General of the U.S. and General Andrew Jackson, asking for them to grant amnesty to the Baratarians. Claiborne cited the popularity the Lafittes had with the population of Louisiana, and the fact that they had offered to provide defense for New Orleans, as arguments that they should be granted their request. Andrew Jackson, who at this time had not yet arrived in New Orleans, was skeptical to say the least. He did not believe that the criminals would hold to their word, and believed pardoning them would give retroactive approval of their past illegal activities. It is likely that Jackson also believed that the Baratarians would not be necessary for the defense of New Orleans, as he had no idea what a sorry state of affairs the fortifications of the city were in. That all changed when he arrived in the city in December. To supplement the 4,000 men that Jackson brought, New Orleans had an untrained volunteer militia of less than 1,000, and only enough seamen to staff 2 warships. Given no other option, Jackson met with a representative of Lafitte's in mid-December to hash out a deal. Lafitte's man was Edward Livingston, whose brother had been the chief negotiator for the American purchase of the Louisiana Territory 11 years earlier. He managed to arrange a complete pardon of all past crimes for Lafitte and the Baratarians, contingent on their service to Jackson in the defense of New Orleans. The Baratarians only had 4 days to integrate themselves into the American troop formations before the advanced units of the British fleet appeared at the mouth of the Mississippi on December 23rd. Ironically, the British forces arrived the day before representatives of the U.S. and Britain finalized the Treaty of Ghent, effectively ending the war, although it would not be ratified by both countries until mid-February. as neither side was aware that the war was over. The first casualties of the Battle of New Orleans came on the evening of December the 23rd. The British had set up camp at Lacoste's plantation just 9 miles south of New Orleans. Surprisingly, the vanguard force did not take the opportunity to continue marching up the unguarded road into the city, and instead waited for the rest of their troops to disembark. Jackson took this chance to execute a surprise attack on the British encampment, resulting in the Americans losing 213 men, 24 of which were killed, and the British losing 277 men, 46 of which were killed. Although the British lost more men, they were able to maintain their position at Lacoste's plantation, and Jackson was forced to withdraw his troops to Rodriguez Canal. The two sides now made preparations to face each other in force. At this time, the defending army consisted of around 5,700 men. Only about 1,000 of these men were professional American soldiers. The rest were Kentucky and Tennessee militia, New Orleans local militia, Native American allies, and Baratarian privateers. The defense was under the overall command of General Andrew Jackson, with Commodore Daniel Patterson serving as second in command. Patterson was the leading military man in New Orleans before Jackson had arrived, and had led the raid on Barataria Island just a few months earlier. Now he would go to battle alongside John Lafitte. Well, not exactly right alongside, as Jean took up position in the bayous north of the American encampment to guard against a possible British wraparound. This meant that he did not see direct action, as Patterson, Jackson, and even his brother Pierre did. Still, his lending of men and munitions was much appreciated. The men who defended New Orleans were also more diverse than those that served on other fronts of the war. Since New Orleans had such a large and prominent free black community, its militia included many men of color, serving in roles from combat to the underrated yet still important signal drummer. However, some people of color participated in the defense against their own will, as slaves were used to help build the fortifications around the city. The British attempted to court the support of these unfortunate laborers by offering freedom to any slave who turned against the Americans. No record of any such activity exists. Alongside the black and white men of New Orleans were a sizable number of Choctaw Native Americans, led by Chief Pushmataha. They cited the history of fair treatment the Choctaw and Chickasaw had received by cooperating with white settlers as the reason why they supported the American cause, while other Indian nations joined the banner of Chief Tecumseh to fight for the British. While many Native Americans believed that fighting for one side or the other in the War of 1812 would improve their chances of their people's survival going into the future, the fact that Pushmataha would die in 1824 while visiting Washington, D.C. to petition the federal government to stop encroaching on native lands shows that all was for naught. On the other side, after Tecumseh and his people served valiantly for the British cause, they were hung out to dry during the Treaty of Ghent negotiations, receiving nothing in return for their great sacrifice. The last little group we must take note of on the American side is of course the Baratarians. As I have already mentioned, both Pierre and Jean participated in the defense, although Pierre took more of a dangerous role than Jean. Jean did, however, provide valuable information about the terrain surrounding New Orleans, particularly the bayous, which allowed Jackson to more effectively plan his defenses. The rest of the Baratarians have perhaps an exaggerated mythos around their contribution to the battle, as only around 50 of them actually took part in the fighting. There were a few recorded instances when their contribution made a big difference, but it was probably their supply of cannons and other arms that made the most difference to the Americans. On the British side, overall command was given to General Edward Pakenham, while Major General Samuel Gibbs served as second in command. Admiral Thomas Cochrane was the overall commander of the supporting naval forces. They were joined by Major General John Keane, who was the original commander of the army that would fight at New Orleans, but whose command was superseded by Pakenham upon arriving in Mississippi. These four men commanded a force of around 8,000, a majority of which were British Army regulars, but there were also thousands of Native American and around 400 free black men serving in the invasion force. The non-British soldiers under Pakenham's command mostly came from Spanish Florida. Spain was an ally of Britain at this time, but they didn't really take an active role in the War of 1812. However, Spain's last few decades of trouble had knocked its grasp over Florida loose, and the territory operated semi-autonomously. The natives of Florida had a vested interest in helping the British, as their most direct threat was American southern expansion. So that's how Pakenham managed to recruit thousands of Floridians. Despite the overall numerical advantage of the British, they had trouble gathering their forces as they lacked the necessary ships to navigate the labyrinth of Louisiana's bayous. As a consequence, Admiral Cochrane was only able to disembark a couple thousand troops at a time. It took about a week for the full strength of the British Army to arrive at their encampment at Lacoste Plantation, and by that time the Americans had managed to build a decent system of fortifications around Rodriguez Canal. Contributing to the delay in mobilization were 2 U.S. Navy vessels who were located on the Mississippi River and used their artillery to harass the disembarking British. Eventually, Pakenham was able to use his own artillery to sink one of the ships and force the other one to run aground and scuttle its guns. The survival of the USS Louisiana may not have seemed like a big deal at the time, since Pakenham had achieved his goal of stopping it from harassing his position, but its guns would prove a decisive factor in the coming battle. This was one occurrence where the help of the Baratarians is recognized, as they were the ones to pull the Louisiana out of harm's way and save its precious cannons. The first test of Jackson's defensive line came on the 28th of December. Before Pakenham had even gathered his full force, he decided to launch an attack to test where New Orleans' defense was weakest. On first glance, this move makes sense. Use a limited force to test your opponent's structure, and then deliver a crushing blow there once you are at full strength. Upon deeper examination, you have to question Pakenham's logic. He would not receive the rest of his troops for at least another 4 days, so even if he did manage to find Jackson's weak spot, he would also alert Jackson to this weakness, and the American general would have 4 days to rectify his strategy. Despite the questionability of this action, Pakenham's plan almost succeeded past his wildest hopes. The American defensive line was named Line Jackson, and it was divided into 2 wings. The right wing was situated next to the Mississippi River and was supported by the artillery that had been salvaged from the Louisiana. The left wing was situated next to a swampy forest that provided a natural barrier against flanking maneuvers. This left wing was made up entirely of volunteer militias and Native American regiments. Pakenham attacked both wings simultaneously to determine which was the weaker. The right wing was able to repulse the attack due to a combination of strict discipline from the American regulars stationed there and supporting fire from artillery on the opposite bank of the Mississippi. Inversely, the less disciplined and under-supported left wing quickly fell into retreat against the onslaught of the British offense. The situation on the left wing was so bad that the British force, which mind you was under strength due to Pakenham still not having his full company on hand, nearly broke through the defensive line. Had they done this, they would have been able to flank the American right wing, crush the defense, and possibly take the city. On this day, Andrew Jackson was just a few yards short of completely losing the most important battle of his career. However, for some unknown reason, Pakenham was tunnel-visioned on his assault on the right wing. When he saw that his forces had failed to make inroads on this front, he decided that the exercise was a failure and ordered all his troops to retreat. Casualties on both sides were low, as the British suffered 59 killed and wounded, while the Americans lost only 17. Still, had Pakenham pressed his advantage on the left wing, it is possible that New Orleans could have been lost. Believing at this point that Line Jackson was too strong for a direct assault to succeed, Pakenham suggested to Admiral Cochrane that they circumvent the defenses by sailing up the Mississippi and invading from a different position. Cochrane was incredulous. He did not believe that the ragtag American militia could stand up to the professional British army, and he refused to provide transport for Pakenham, telling him that even his sailors could execute a successful land attack against such a weak opponent. The timidity of Pakenham and the arrogance of Cochrane would prove to be fatal flaws in the British assault of New Orleans. While the British were bickering over what their next course of attack would be, Jackson took the lessons of the failed probing attack and began improving his line. He rebuilt the earthworks along the left wing and sent cannons to that front so they could better hold against a direct British assault. By the time nearly all the British troops had gathered on January 1st, 1815, Jackson Line was an even more formidable obstacle than it had been when it withstood Pakenham's last assault. Believing that he had the advantage in heavy weapons, Pakenham decided to soften the American defenses with a prolonged artillery duel on the morning of New Year's Day. He would supplement this bombardment with a strike at the American left wing, where his troops had nearly broken through less than a week earlier. Major General Gibbs led this assault, but this time the Choctaws and their militias held the ground against the British and forced them to withdraw. Once again, casualty numbers were low, and once again the British suffered more than the Americans. Although Pakenham still held an advantage in numbers, if he kept bleeding men on these futile, weak assaults, he would eventually be ground down by the American defenses. That is why he finally decided to put his entire weight into the next attack, to knock Jackson out in one decisive blow. The last of the British force arrived on January 5th, and the British commanders agreed that in 3 days they would launch their all-out attack on Line Jackson. Keep in mind that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed and ratified by the British government over a week ago, and was just awaiting approval from the American government. Whoops. To give credit to General Pakenham, his plan for the attack was more intelligently designed than just charging his men straight into the now heavily fortified American position. He too had learned some lessons from the probing attack last week. He had learned that the reason that his attack on the right wing had failed was because the cannons on the far bank of the Mississippi had been allowed to fire on him as he approached, and there was no cover on the way to the defensive line to stop the artillery from shredding his column. Pakenham's plan was to turn these cannons to his advantage. The final assault would begin with one of Pakenham's subordinates leading a covert operation under the cover of darkness, across the river, taking the gun battery and turning its firepower onto the Americans. Once this was completed, the main assault would begin against the American right wing, with supporting columns near the river, a diversionary attack on the left wing, and a brigade held in reserve to provide help to whichever front needed it. By attacking both wings and the far bank in tandem with the central thrust, Pakenham forced the Americans to spread their numbers out across their entire line. Like I said, it was an intelligently designed plan that looked to nullify the few advantages the Americans had, while exploiting their numerical inferiority by not allowing them to concentrate their forces at a single location. But as the saying goes, no plan survives contact with the enemy, or in this case, contact with the Louisiana mud. The covert operation that the whole assault hinged on did not start off smoothly. The British had planned to ferry 1,500 men across the river using 42 small boats, but these boats got stuck in the mud and had to be dragged by the men out to the river. As the Brits were struggling through the mud, American scouts on the far bank spotted them and called for reinforcements. Not all the boats made it through the mud, and in the end the operation went forward with less than a third of its original strength and 12 hours behind schedule. On top of this, the swift current of the Mississippi carried the assault force almost a mile further downriver than they had planned. Pakenham made the executive decision to continue with the original plan, as he hoped that even though the covert attack had not gone according to his wishes, they would probably be able to distract the artillery battery long enough for his main thrust to achieve its objective. Surprisingly, the operation did more than just distract the battery. The 500 British regulars were able to drive off the Americans, who had been reinforced up to 700 men, and take the position on the right bank. However, this was a Pyrrhic victory, and the only part of the overall Battle of New Orleans that could be even considered a success for the British. Once again, they had suffered more casualties than the Americans, and assessed that they could not hold the position they had taken with the few men they had left. So it was partially successful. The British had managed to silence the battery on the 8th of January, which would allow Pakenham's main attack to proceed unhindered, but they had failed to turn these guns on the Americans. Over the next 2 days, the British would withdraw from the far bank, and the Americans would move back in. Meanwhile, the British prepared to launch the main assault against the American right wing. Well, actually they were failing to prepare for the main assault. Field command of the all-important 44th Regiment of Foot was assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mullins. Mullins was by all accounts an incredibly arrogant and idiotic commander. It was his and his regiment's job to carry the ladders and makeshift bridges that would be used to cross Rodriguez Canal and scale the American defenses. He had one job, bring the ladders. On the morning of January 8th, as the covert operation was taking the far bank, Mullins, his regiment, and the rest of the British army were getting into position. It was dark and there was a heavy fog over the battlefield, which was good news for the British as they would be able to advance under low visibility, which would prevent the American artillery from accurately shelling them. Except there was one problem. Mullins had forgotten the ladders and bridges. He quickly scrambled to send the bulk of his force back to retrieve them, but this caused two more issues to occur. Firstly, now the formation was spread out between the front lines and the camp, where the ladders were stored. Secondly, the attack had to be delayed. The sun was rising and the fog was clearing. By the time the rest of the British army was advancing, their most important regiment, the 44th, was in complete disarray and lacking the materials needed to surpass the American defenses. On the American side, they had been preparing all night for the British assault. Since the attack on the far bank had been spotted by their scouts, Jackson had known that a major operation was coming soon, and so he went to work, rousing his men and preparing them for a brutal, well-organized, and dangerous all-out assault. What they witnessed instead, as the sun rose on the morning of January the 8th, was a disorderly mob of redcoats marching into range of the American cannons. The first volley of artillery sent this mob into panic and confusion. This barrage killed a number of officers, including Pakenham's right-hand man, Major General Gibbs. Almost immediately, the chain of command was thrown into disarray. The last standing orders that had been issued were to continue the assault, so the few regiments that weren't running around like chickens with their heads cut off approached the first line of American defenses. But they had no ladders and no bridges, so at a certain point they could no longer continue forward. Additionally, they were now within range of American rifles and grape shot. The grape shot in particular tore through the British, killing Pakenham, wounding Major General Keane, and decimating the British regulars. Finally, General Lambert, who was in charge of the reserves, realized that he was now the ranking officer on the field. He ordered a general retreat and moved his reserves in to provide covering fire for the fleeing redcoats. The meticulously planned attack had been the culmination of 3 weeks' worth of gathering British strength, and it was over in less than half an hour. Up until this point, the British had slowly bled more casualties than their American counterparts in every engagement. The Battle of New Orleans on January 8th was a whole other level of disaster. The Americans suffered 71 total casualties, including 13 dead. The British suffered upwards of 2,037 casualties, including 291 dead. Of these casualties, there were a shocking number who were high-ranking officers, including the overall commander, General Pakenham. Most of the casualties had come as a result of American heavy guns, those being cannons, artillery, and mortars. Despite Jackson's overwhelming victory in the Battle of New Orleans, the city was not out of the woods quite yet. The ground assault by General Pakenham was supposed to be only one half of a two-pronged attack. The still formidable British Navy sailed up the Mississippi River the day after the battle and began the siege of Fort St. Philip. The fort held out for 10 days against the Royal Navy, at which point Admiral Cochrane concluded that the risk of a continued assault in conjunction with the dismal failure of Pakenham's attack meant that the capture of New Orleans was now out of reach. On January 19th, the Royal Navy retreated back down the river, while the British Army simultaneously withdrew from their encampment at Lacost's plantation. By February 12th, the combined British Army and Navy in the Gulf decided to shift their focus to Mobile, Alabama, but news of the American ratification of the Treaty of Ghent and the end of the War of 1812 aborted these plans. What was the significance of the Battle of New Orleans? Why was it so important to American history? These aren't as simple questions as they might seem at face value. The Battle of New Orleans exists as a peculiar anomaly, a sort of Schrodinger's cat of historical events. It is both inconsequential and extremely consequential. Its impact on the overall outcome of the War of 1812 is completely non-existent. Its impact on the consequences of the War of 1812 is astronomical. By the time the battle occurred, the Treaty of Ghent had already been finalized and signed. Whether the Americans or the British had won at New Orleans, the outcome of the war was already set in stone. The Treaty of Ghent itself accomplished effectively nothing. There were very little territorial changes, and no changes to British policy on the impressment of sailors. The largest monetary penalty was that which the British government paid to Southern slave owners in compensation for the slaves the British Army had freed during the war. The most consequential change that came about as a result of the war and the treaty was that the Native American nations that had once been a strong bulwark against American westward expansion were now severely weakened by the war and left in the lurch by the British who had relied on them. This resulted in a strengthened American expansionism for the rest of the 19th century. This was of course horrible for the indigenous people, but the settlement of the rest of the continent by the Americans will be an important influence on New Orleans going forward. The consequences of the Battle of New Orleans are less often talked about. That is, other than the impact it had on Andrew Jackson's political career. In order to categorize these consequences, we will first start with the local, how the battle changed the face of New Orleans and Louisiana, and then zoom out to the rest of the country. If you recall, the War of 1812 broke out just 6 weeks after Louisiana became the 18th state admitted to the Union. It was at this time still predominantly inhabited by Creoles, European settlers, and slaves, both foreign and domestic. All of these people had one thing in common: they were not Americans. Sure, they were Americans on paper, but they practiced various cultural traditions that were distinct from the largely Anglo-Saxon descended people of the original 13 colonies. Even the slaves, who had either been born in Louisiana during the European colonial rule or been brought from Africa or other European colonies such as Saint Domingue and Cuba, were different culturally from the American slaves. The differences between the population of New Orleans and its government made rebellion a proverbial sword of Damocles hanging over the head of Governor Claiborne. While there hadn't been any evidence of an organized plot of Louisianians to overthrow the U.S. government, the disdain the local Creoles had for the English speakers was well known. It seemed, at least for the time being, that mutual interest in promoting trade in New Orleans would keep anything dramatic from happening, but should there be a significant disruption in the economic fortunes of the city, well, hunger is the catalyst for any revolution. As the War of 1812 dragged on, the likelihood of such cataclysmic disruption became larger and larger, and the government in New Orleans got more and more worried. In fact, the reason why Andrew Jackson's army was called to defend New Orleans was not just because there were reports of a large British force in the region. It was also because the Americans feared that in the event of a siege, the Creoles would rise up and either declare independence or hand the city over to the British. It turned out that these fears were unfounded. When Andrew Jackson called upon the locals for their help, the militia answered, and even private citizens, such as the Lafitte's, lent aid to the American army for the defense of New Orleans. You could cynically say that the New Orleanians were just trying to bet on the winning horse, but their willingness to put their lives on the line in an American war goes to show how much their attitudes towards their new overlords had shifted. After the battle, their attitudes shifted even more. There were huge celebrations and parades honoring the brave American soldiers who had defended New Orleans. Andrew Jackson became a local hero, so much so that they renamed the central square, the heart of the city, after him. While the Creoles maintained their traditional ties to Europe, there was now no question as to their loyalty to America. They continued to speak French, print French newspapers, and dance French dances, but there was a marked decrease in the number of brawls that broke out as a consequence of clashing cultural tastes. Louisiana may have become a U.S. territory in 1803 and a state in 1812, but it really wasn't until the 1815 Battle of New Orleans that it truly joined the Union. To understand the impact of the Battle of New Orleans on the broader American project, we have to understand the context of the War of 1812. The war had never been broadly popular, as the reason it even started in the first place was a sense of wounded national pride. In the early years of the American Republic, this national pride was hardly ubiquitous. The surge of patriotism that had come with the War of Independence had faded by the early 1800s, and states were more focused on their own interests than those of the nation as a whole. While each state had its own problems and own goals, They broadly split into camps of North and South. The northern states were industrializing modern economies that relied on manufacturing and the trade of finished goods. The southern states were quasi-feudal slavocracies that relied on the production of cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, and sugar, which were harvested by a large population of enslaved people. Of these two groups, the northern states were more likely to oppose the war. For one thing, the British blockade disproportionately hurt the mercantile class of the North. For another, most of the fighting took place around the northern border with Canada, and the militias of the northern states took the bulk of the casualties. These factors led to a general desire in the northern states for an end to the war, whatever the cost. This dissatisfaction found its political champion in one of the major political parties, Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party. It was the Federalist Party that heavily pushed for the ratification of the Treaty of Ghent, and who publicly denounced the war as being fought for no good reason and having achieved no good outcome. There was so much dislike for how fruitless the war had been that even some of the most radical Federalists called for the northern states to secede from the Union. These secessionists were an insignificant minority, but it just goes to show the depth of anger around the War of 1812. In the waning days of 1814, the Federalists gathered in Hartford, Connecticut, for a convention that would draw up a set of demands to send to the federal government. The finalized report they sent to Congress in February of 1815 was anything but radical. Most of the amendments they proposed had more to do with limiting the power of their political rivals, Thomas Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party, rather than railing against the War of 1812 or threatening secession. However, before they could submit this report, news had reached the country of the victory at New Orleans and the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which was perceived as an honorable peace agreement that reaffirmed American sovereignty. These two events totally flipped popular perception of the war and made the Federalists' anti-war stance seem anti-American. A resurgence of patriotism across the country led to the end of the Federalist Party as a serious political threat. Had the Battle of New Orleans not occurred, or not been such an overwhelming victory for the U.S., it is unlikely that the Federalist Party would have been so discredited. Furthermore, its collapse led to the near-total domination of the Democratic Republicans over the federal government. The elections of 1816, a year after the end of the war, saw the Democratic-Republican presidential candidate, James Monroe, win nearly 73% of the popular vote in all but 3 states' electoral votes. Furthermore, the election led to the DR's control of 25 of the 38 Senate seats. For the next 10 years, politics virtually ceased to exist, as the DRs had no rivals to power. This time is often called the era of good feelings, as patriotism swept the nation and there was a pervasive mood of unity for the first time since the American Revolution. So it wasn't just New Orleans that felt a new connection to American identity. The rest of the country really began to solidify behind the Democratic-Republican regime. However, the internal contradictions between the northern and southern states remained unresolved, and so the era of good feelings would only last 10 years before the DRs split and partisan politics resumed. The lasting political effect of the Battle of New Orleans was keeping the country together for the next 45 years, until the pent-up pressure of competing ideologies eventually led to the Civil War. But that's a story for way down the road. For now, I want to talk about how the Battle of New Orleans affected Andrew Jackson. It is often cited that the victory at New Orleans was the reason that Jackson was able to win the 1828 presidential election and become the first president representing the Democratic Party. Jackson used the Battle of New Orleans and his subsequent career as a frontier general to build a populist persona as a war hero and American patriot. Surprisingly, though, it seems like the glory of the battle had faded in the minds of Louisiana in the 13 years between the fighting and the election, as Louisiana was one of the more contested states in the election. He only won the state with 53% of the vote, as opposed to Georgia, where he won with over 96%. While the Battle of New Orleans may have contributed to his overall presidential victory, it seems as though it was really just one piece of the populist image he cultivated, rather than its defining feature. We will end this episode there, and I will pick up next time with the aftermath in New Orleans of the battle, including the conclusion of John Lafitte's story. So please join me in the next episode for the history of New Orleans. Oh, before I go, I wanted to point out that purely by accident, this episode is being uploaded on the 210th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans, which was a national holiday from 1828 to 1861. Kind of funny that it only became a holiday and a significant event in the broad American historical canon after Jackson became president. Anyway, bye!